Thanks. Okay, everyone, before you leave, I won't talk about that because, we had lots of talks, no breaks. I would be bored to death to listen now to an orange pilling talk like that. So I'll just turn it around like that. I'll tell you the opposite, be a bit surprising maybe. I won't tell you how Bitcoin will bring about free cities. I'll tell you how free cities brought about Bitcoin. And of course, I'll need to go way back in history to start there, at a time when the world was very different from today. So only very clouded and distorted memories have survived. And the most of what I will tell you, I think most of you will never have heard about or read about that. So it's really the darkest corner of history. So that age long gone was the 1990s. Imagine in the 1990s, people didn't have smartphones. Most didn't use email. It was very odd. You got your news from printed paper, which was extremely slow and boring compared to memes on TikTok, of course. And it was filtered. So imagine the surprise when in one very serious magazine, printed magazine of the time, there was a one-page ad, which was so crazy and so unbelievable at the time that it really made some waves back then. It was about a free city. It mentioned the grandmother of this movement, more or less, way back, Ayn Rand. She wrote about Galt's Gulch. And what was surprising was it seemed it was a dystopian book, but it had this hopeful idea of going someplace. If society you're in doesn't treat you well, try out something new. And he figured out that money would be the crucial thing, but also autonomy would be a crucial thing. Also kind of crypto would be a crucial thing because you get to hide. And then when she was asked, well, how do we get there? She had these crazy ideas. She thought, how about 1,000 people get together, start negotiating with a third world country, and buy sovereignty of a piece of land. And this ad in the mid-90s actually claimed that, it's time now, we'll start a laissez-faire city. It was a group of investors. They toured Latin America at the time, and they had a very good lead. It was the agreement of, in Peru, high-ranking politicians were very open to the idea of having a free city in Peru. So back at the time, what did he do when you saw an ad like that? He used the fax. He wrote a fax. That was a thing at the time, or snail mail if you didn't have fax yet. So they got thousands of people responding, and it was great. And they raised money, and they were ready to go. But then Fujimori, the president of Peru in the 90s, decided, no, we're not going to do that free city. Come on. Laissez-faire, that's something terrible. We don't want to have that here. So it fell through, but of this original group, I'll talk about two people with some outsized importance and influence. So one of the guys who went on the tour was James Dale Davidson. And while he was on tour, he already had a portable computer, so he was very far ahead. At the time, it was a heavy brick thing, and he started typing because what he saw is not that's not just a single project now. He experienced for the first time, wow, we are a new group of mobile people with mobile capital. So things are going to change, and they will change rapidly. And of course, we always overrate change in the short term, and we underrate it in the long term. So he wrote, based on these notes, The Sovereign Individual, the book Titus mentioned. And interestingly, it wasn't only prophetic for free cities. It was one of the first books to mention cryptographic cyber money as a crucial element in bringing liberty and being part of the order. It was a very crazy idea at the moment. He referred to a very crazy, discredited economist, Hayek, of this Austrian school. No one really listens to that anymore. Over time, that had quite some influence, that just writing it down as a non-fiction trend. But there was another person, a more practical one. He was James May Houston. And I'd say he's the inventor of the tokenized synthetic asset. What was his business model? First he started with lottery pools, like he had people put together money and buy lottery tickets. So I think it's a faulty idea, but still it seemed to be appealing to people to increase your chance of winning to get lottery tickets. But then he realized something. Hey, why we don't have to buy the lottery tickets? We can just like make a bet on the outcome of the lottery. So we get in the money for the lottery. And of course, if a lottery ticket wins, it's like a bet on the lottery ticket, and then we'll pay you out from the money we got for the lottery tickets. And I think it was a very pioneering idea of a tokenized synthetic asset. It's more or less what happened with many tokenized places later then. Of course, for that thing, he ended up in prison and he died there. But I mean, you got to be early, you got to be a pioneer. Something else he realized. Something else he realized. It was like, okay, yeah, let's not give the money back to the investors because actually there's a much more important idea in the short term. He got the appeal of digital tools for freedom. So he took the money and he started an kind of intentional community in Costa Rica with the funds, and they had a very interesting idea. They rented rooms within the embassy of Nicaragua, sovereign place within the country, and they started developing cryptographic tools. And one of the guys was L. Orrin Krebe. He was a really good IT guy, and he developed a digital monetary trust, one of the first digital monetary schemes, and he developed the first decentralized digital exchange, and he developed the first digital encrypted forum kind of software for people to get together. But then this Mr. Houston, of course, it was more the entrepreneurial guy. He said, oh my God, like software development, that's terrible. It takes so long. People don't really get what you're working on. No one is using the stuff because, I mean, let's be honest, no one really cares about privacy that much. So let's get something up and running. And he just like set up a forum and said, okay, that's the thing already. It wasn't really encrypted. It's like you had a password to get in, but that was like laissez-faire city. So he sold that at laissez-faire city. And in a sense, he was a guy like fake it until you make it. We've got to bring together people. They got to talk about. And then he set up a monetary system on that forum, like you send in money and you had ODC trades for a ledger money that you can use, and you had an exchange. And so, like in opposition to the proper encrypted tools that were developed, they were used because it was a forum. And then, of course, he created more users, like he had 8 sock puppets of himself pushing the whole thing, and of course why it's not a scam, why you're all early, why it's great. So he was also an inventor of the ICO, I'd say, and lots of things to come. So a very pioneering person in that sense. But of course eventually the whole thing went down when the trust was lost. And from these experiences now people learned something, that there's a problem of centralization even in tools, and there's a problem of trust even within trusted groups like libertarians. So how do we make sure that no bad guys are entering and scamming you? Because ideological affiliation is a great ferment for con games, of course. So people lived through that many, many times. And so one idea was like, and that was James Dale Davidson's approach, was like, you got to connect it to real value. So he also was prophetic about the thing that then arose and had quite some success. E-gold in 1999, e-gold emerged, the first properly used digital currency, which really had usage. I used it myself, but then I realized a few years later, suddenly all my e-gold was owned by the CIA, and I had to prove that I'm no threat to the United States, which wasn't that easy, to somehow get it back. So we learned something else, like, okay, well, I thought like digital ledger is not going to be working. But the main thing was like the Oracle problem, of course. Oh, I forgot something. Houston was even more pioneering here. Like he had, before e-gold, he had a kind of silver scheme. And it was like, oh, I'm going to store the silver for you. You only pay $30 a month. Of course, he didn't always have the silver there, like classical fractional reserve banking. But it was quite pioneering. It was a ledger, so you got the silver on a ledger, more or less. And then they only found out there was not enough silver. So with e-gold, the Dr. Jackson, he was a pretty honest guy. He really had the gold, but that was the issue. The gold was really there when the government confiscated it for like money laundering and what have you not. So then in 2008, something appeared, and it was like, yeah, we're not going to solve the oracle problem of having outside value. Let's not have any outside value, and let's focus on the decentralization thing, which is a kind of fake it until you make it. I mean, it had zero value. And then they did something very crazy. So of course, I knew when I learned about it in 2009, I knew that it's going to be a failure, and a big failure at that thing, because it wasn't even encrypted. I mean, most people assume like Bitcoin is this great cryptocurrency. It basically only uses a public-private key pair, but almost nothing is encrypted. It's not anonymous, so they was like crazy. Why did they go for it? Because they thought the more important problem was like figuring out the trust issue there. You want to have people cooperating without the government and executing against it. So a very difficult to understand choice, and no value, of course, is kind of bootstrapping. So I realized, yeah, okay, it's picked up by people, by libertarians, and I thought like libertarians are like this kind of society for creative anachronism. So they are LARPers, basically. Was my verse. So they are LARPing, live action role playing. They are memeing and LARPing a value in existence. And then, of course, what happens with most things that fake it until you make it. You really make it until people realize, okay, you're faking it, and then you don't make it anymore. But somehow, some things, I mean, with gradual process of failures, people learn and they discover something, and I think that's how technological and political change really happens, discoveries. And you discover from the failures of pioneers, and it takes a while for like principles to make their way through societies, and people like discovered something with Bitcoin that's really is the most boring use case. That's the most appealing. It's a savings technology, which is very old, the bootstrapped savings technology, which had no value, and then the kind of network effect then gets value, but really solves this decentralization or centralization problem really well. But the most important thing about Bitcoin is it did not fail, and I mean the likelihood is so close to zero of it not failing for 15 years, because I knew it would fail in 2009, and then in 2011, of course, I was like 110% sure with Silk Road it's going to fail, and it was like and then Mt. Gox in 2014. It was always, and then and then later, like the Chinese crackdown and all the things. It was so obvious that it's going to be failing. So it didn't fail for a while, and I think that's also how things survive not failing and then, in a sense, being boring. So I was supposed to talk a bit about Bitcoin, citadels. So now Bitcoin, of course, this big thing. It's like, this is a big conference, but a few months ago I was speaking at a conference here, and it was 6,000 people, and they all came for Bitcoin. Like, okay, wow, it's in Prague, it's a thing, it's a thing now. It has failed upwards in a way. And there's this Bitcoin conference in Amsterdam now, and they had a panel on Bitcoin citadels, and like the title of the panel was like, there are Bitcoin citadels built all around Europe. I was like, wow, that's amazing. Until I realized, okay, it's a kind of network effect. It's a kind of fake it until you make it. What does it mean? Every conference, of course, a Bitcoin citadel is like, you go, I'm speaking at many Bitcoin conferences, but of course I know you're not coming for speakers. You're coming to meet other people that are into Bitcoin, and there's a thing, so every conference is a kind of small intentional community for a while. It's a kind of network effect of people getting together. And then sometimes you'd say, okay, I'm at a nice location. It would be great if other Bitcoiners or other libertarians or what have you would move there. So it's a kind of a peer You want to have that network effect, and that I think has to be appreciated. It's a thing, but it'll only, of course, survive a while if there's something real then coming out of it, and in a sense failing upward from these citadel things. And then, of course, I know lots of people who say they are having Bitcoin citadels. It usually means a kind of real estate thing, of course, because citadel is something physical. And now it's really hard to explain why Bitcoiners should go into real estate, because for Bitcoiners, who have failed upwards over 15 years, they know that real estate is a shitcoin, which means it's a fiat-driven, inflated, distorted, bad incentive asset. Still, I mean, relatively, it can be an okay asset if you're in the right location. So why would it do that? And it's basically just two reasons. The one is consumption. And of course, we have this outside Keynesian idea, like consumption is the thing driving the economy. No, but we have the approach of the Austrian school is consumption is important. It's an expression of your values. And Mises said, it's like your voting ticket about what is there in the real world. What do you want to have? What do you want to see in the real world? Of course, we also just call, we are very, very value neutral. See, we're very down to earth. We just call that a kind of consumption. So of course, you can be into real estate projects as a kind of consumption. And then with investments, of course, always the question, when do you need the return? Is a very short-term investment, and probably anything that's crazier out there won't really attract your attention. But if you go with a very low time preference, very long horizon things, and things that may have a turnout in the future, they seem like philanthropic projects. A philanthropic project is really an investment where you don't expect a positive monetary return in your lifetime. It doesn't mean that it won't have some impact or some return. So it could be philanthropy as well, or let's call it very long-term investment. That more seems like philanthropy, but you still need reasons for doing that. And I think it explains also why Bitcoin is that closely linked. So not only from the origins, but also from making something very practical possible. And what does Bitcoin provide? Savings that have not failed for a while. So if you did it like you fail upwards, in a sense, you figured out that volatility can be your friend if it's mostly upside volatility over long term, and you did it the right way, which means don't be cyclical. You're not interested in Bitcoin when the price is the highest. You're interested in it when the price is low. But of course, most of the interest then comes very cyclical. So if you realize it's like a long-term thing that bootstrapped itself up and solved a very basic thing, then you can understand what it is. And from the point of view of the Austrian school, of course, there's a precondition for every kind of conscious consumption where you pick the time of consumption. You're not just consuming what is here right now, but you want to be so conscious that you even pick the time. Like, I want to have something. Maybe it's here in 5 or 10 years, and I pick it. Or you want to invest, of course, into something, and the precondition is you have savings, and those savings somehow survived. And if we look like through the history of our grandparents and great-grandparents, we see, oh, okay, the likelihood in some phases of history for savings to survive and then be there to build something anew when everything else comes crashing down is very low. So that's really, I think, a limiting condition for anything new to be built up, that there'll be some people who have not failed, and most investments fail, and they fail at a higher rate when there is economic turmoil, of course. So you have people who have not failed for a while and have stuck to something and then be ready either to consume something new or invest in something new. That's also the Bitcoin citadels I see being built. I built myself these days, which is trying to provide residential room for European Bitcoiners who do something very contrarian, as they tend to be, and something is considered crazy and immoral. Even they're having kids, crazy idea, and they have a certain approach of how you raise kids in a contrarian but positive way, and that's the appeal of like Bitcoin as a filter. It's the only contrarian movement of size that is positive, that's not like defensive, as like, oh, everyone is against us. Because otherwise you have most contrarians have a very large proportion of losers and lunatics. Because that was a great reason, like I'm failing, that's why society is bad, or that's the reason for it. So finding positive contrarians really is the great thing about Bitcoin as a filter. And then of course it's a market, because it's a reach of people with a certain set of values. So thank you for your attention. I hope I've surprised you a little bit.